Has it really been 5 years since Marv Wolfman and I sat in a small restaurant and gleefully plotted the death of a cute teenage girl? Marv and I sat across from one another in that diner booth and he told me about this new character he'd just invented. A 15-year-old girl named Terra. She was to be the first new Teen Titan to join the team since the inception of the series, but she would also be the first to die. So, let's take a look at the new Teen Titans' most famous storyline, the Judas Contract, and its adaptation. No, not that one. I will be getting to that one, but I did promise people I would be stepping away from the DCAMU for a while. I've still got a bit more flogging to do, but the horse is well and truly dead. But I did also promise people an In the Comics episode on the Judas Contract, so let's take a look at this storyline and the arc it inspired in the new Teen Titans animated series. For any newcomers, In the Comics is a series where I take comics and the movies and TV shows that are based on them, look at what they each did the same, look at what each iteration did better, and then look at what each did differently just to service the stories they were telling. So let's finally take a look at the Judas Contract, and in doing so, take a look at the girl whom Deathstroke described as the best little sociopath he'd ever known. So despite the fact that the Teen Titans animated series is mostly just taking inspiration from the Judas Contract storyline other than trying to be a direct adaptation like what the movie was, we start off in a broadly similar fashion with Terra getting chased and using her powers over Earth to escape, as is witnessed by the Titans. She is brought back to the tower, the Titans discuss what to do with her and ultimately decide to help her. An emergency occurs where Robin decides they might need her help and her powers, so she joins the team on a mission. She ultimately earns their trust. Raven feels some malevolent energy coming from her, but Terra ends up earning her trust too. But who should be watching all this unfold but Deathstroke? He and Terra have a confrontation where she uses her immense powers, but Slade manages to outmaneuver her with his tactical fighting ability. Terra and the Titans fight Slade, and through Terra's effort, they manage to save something precious and she is officially considered a Titan. Fun fact though, all this actually took place in the comic before the Judas Contract storyline even started. But in long-running series like this, stories will inevitably blend together. So I would like to thank Marv Wolfman and George Perez for creating such a wonderfully written, interconnected series. But also, a curse upon their names and a pox upon their houses, because you have no idea how much I had to read to get the full scope of this story. I mean, just to get a complete idea of Deathstroke's motivation, I had to go back to the very first issue of New Teen Titans. So yeah, apologies for this episode having taken so long, but you have one of the best writing duos in DC Comics history to thank for it. So once the Judas Contract actually begins, it is then revealed to us that Terra is working for Slade. She is spying on the Titans, providing him with crucial information to take them down. She and Beast Boy have a little bit of a romance before it's revealed that she's been working for Slade the whole time. Slade either turns on her or seemingly turns on her, causing her to release the full force of her powers, triggering a volcanic eruption which leads to her death, and the Teen Titans create a memorial plaque for her reading Terra, a Teen Titan. There are also a few small things that remain the same, such as each Titan's individual reaction to Terra. Beast Boy is infatuated, Raven is suspicious, Robin is pragmatic, Cyborg is pretty easy-ozy about her, and Starfire likes everyone. The only other thing that really stuck out to me as being particularly similar was Slade's very calculated use of terms of endearment.
Pretty quiet up here since all the people cleared out.
Get used to it, my dear.
Nothing massive, just an interesting thing I noticed both iterations using for the same purpose to equally good effect. Other than that, they are leagues apart. So, because the show is more well known, and also because I'll have to do quite a bit of setup for the comic, I'm going to start with what the show did better. The main thing I think the show did better was the relationship between Slade and Terra. Where the Judas Contract movie failed, one of the many areas in which it failed, was that they tried to make Terra's backstory almost comedically tragic in how desperate it was in order to justify her being manipulated by Slade. Yeah. Because vulnerable teenagers only fall prey to manipulative and predatory adults when they've almost been lynched. This also takes away from Deathstroke's character, as his ability to manipulate isn't put to the test nearly as much as it could be. He picked the lowest hanging fruit. The animated series, in turning Terra into a lost girl, not only showcased Slade's predatory nature and ability to manipulate, but it showed its young viewers how easy it can be to fall prey to someone who is older and smarter than you, especially at a point in your life when you're vulnerable. It doesn't matter how much sense Slade is making. Just don't take candy from the strange man, kids. He always wants something. I was going to make this a neutral change in relation to the comic because due to Terra being an outright villainess in that iteration, this would have been impossible. Slade and Terra's relationship is really more transactional in nature. But still, I think because their interactions were little more than flirts and threats, sometimes both at the same time, it didn't really dive all that deeply into how a psychopath and a man with minimal conscience would interact. A relationship between two people who have significantly less feeling for their fellow man and each other than two normal people would do would have been interesting. They didn't have to dive into this, but it does ultimately mean the show did it better. A thing that really surprised me was the fact that the show had superior visual storytelling. Not to knock Perez's art in any way, I mean, just look at this. But I think his art is more focused on spectacle in the macro and character reactions in the micro. I don't think he's that much of a symbolic artist. The show, however, has wonderful visual symbolism, constantly portraying Terra's anxiety, fear, and confliction with no words spoken. And that is to say nothing about the visual storytelling surrounding Slade's character in the entire show. How much larger he is than the Titans, but Terra in particular, just how menacing and malevolent the cinematography makes him feel, even though most of the words he speaks with different framing and delivery could be portrayed as gentle and helpful.
But it doesn't have to be this way. I can help you, child.
It gives you chills sometimes, it really does.
Good, Robin. Now I have you all to myself.
God, Slade, you are such a creep. One thing I have to say that the show did indisputably better was Beast Boy. Beast Boy in the comic is just the worst kind of insufferable. And it doesn't come across as an insecure young boy just trying to make people laugh and missing the mark. It comes across like he's just being a creep, especially in the way he talks to women. Not only in what he says, though that's certainly not great either, but the fact that it is just constant. Beast Boy in the show, while he does have his annoying moments, is genuinely endearing, and the fact that there were real feelings between these two serves to make his character all the more likeable. Not that there was no nuance in the comic, as Beast Boy, even to the end, held on to the belief that Terra was a good person deep down, and it was all Deathstroke's manipulation that made her do those things. Yes, it was a good narrative about not being naive, and the purpose of its inclusion was to tell the reader, don't be like Beast Boy. There are some people in this world who will manipulate you and use you for their own gain. It was also quite meta, as Perez stated that Terra was not a response to the introduction of Kitty Pryde in the X-Men comics, but very much inspired by it, as she was a sweet, good teenage girl who was primed to become a hero. Terra was basically the anti-Kitty Pryde. The whole point of the Judas Contract and her character was to flip storytelling conventions on their head. You had the heroes and you had the villains, and both of them were primed to look a certain way and be portrayed a certain way. But Wolfman and Perez really wanted to say to the audience, no, she's a villain. And it was also challenging readers to accept the sad and scary truth that some people have no sympathetic reasons for doing what they do. Some people have power and choose to use it for themselves. So Beast Boy illogically holding on to the idea that she was good served as a statement to the audience. But at the same time, I'm still saying the show did it better because after everything Terra said, every single piece of very clear and concise vitriol she threw at him, I'm like, dude, she's just not that into you. How much venom does she have to spit in your direction for you to get that? And the last thing I would like to say the series did better was Terra's end. No, not that one. This one. This was quite controversial because I think it can be a hard thing for kids to understand. And this is actually a way that the show flipped storytelling conventions on its head. Because I saw this as Terra accepting that even though she had powers, she wasn't cut out to be a hero. She tried heroism and all it did was bring her pain. All she did was make mistakes. Many heroic narratives have the hero get up and try again and again and again until they get it. Terra doesn't. She's just not that kind of person. And I get this. Many people born into power are wholly unsuited to it. So it brings forth the very unique perspective that just because you can do something doesn't always mean you should. I know a lot of people don't like this and don't even consider it an ending, but I do. This is the life she's chosen for herself. And I really respect that. Right. Time to move on to what the comic did better, and strap yourselves in because I've got feelings about this. Terra was around for a while before the Judas Contract even began. There were at least 8 full storylines where Terra was just a part of the team, just working missions with them and hanging out. They also took time to establish her trying to gain the trust of the other members of the group. Some took to her quickly, others took more time. But they gave both the audience and the team so much time to accept her for both her skills and as a person, which went a long way to making the audience pray she could be redeemed. And I will go into this in a little more depth later, but the uniqueness of this character is tied to her not being redeemed. She was someone who was first presented as a hero, fleshed out, and then the writers smacked us in the face with the fact that it was all an act, and instead of doing what every other writer would have done and given her character a redemption arc, they said, no. She was the bad guy. She fooled you into thinking she cared. It happens. And that's kind of what makes me a little disappointed in the animated series. Not because this Terra was redeemable, but that they didn't have all that time and all those episodes just showing Terra being a Titan, fighting with them, hanging out with them. That's all confined to flashbacks and moments of regret, and all these flashbacks serve to do is make me ask, why didn't we see this? But I know there is a behind-the-scenes answer to that. This show was mandated to be the kind of series kids could just tune into and start watching. Because as a crotchety old millennial, I actually remember the days when that was how we consumed media. I think even my generation forgets how differently media was consumed back then and how that affected how media was constructed. On-demand watching is the way of the world. We did have the ability to record shows, but that was mostly just used if you were going to miss an episode because you were doing something else. But for the most part, we watched our media when it was on. This creates a demand for a very different kind of storytelling because if your show is on a schedule and a channel surfer catches it halfway through, they would be more likely to give up on it because they missed the start of the story. So the writers may have wanted to tell longer running, more meaningful storylines, but they had to sacrifice that in order to make the show more accessible. I understand this now in a way I didn't when I first laid out my gripes with this series. But it does still ultimately mean that in a storytelling sense, the comic did it better. Terra appears, then disappears. The Titans go off and have unrelated adventures, and then she comes back, and even after she comes back, the flow of the Judas Contract narrative is interrupted by episodes that don't tie into the story even a little. And I just wonder how great a Judas Contract story we could have had if the writers were able to structure the show in a way I presume they would have rather. Though granted, it is impressive that they managed to establish a lot of feeling, relationships, and motivation in what little time they did give themselves. It just falls short in what the comic achieved in that area. One thing we actually get to see in the comic is Slade and Terra training together. This actually establishes early on something very important which will contribute to her death: her ability to use her earth powers on nearby volcanoes. This certainly didn't come out of nowhere in the animated series, as it could be interpreted that she just buried the volcanoes using her earth powers, which I'm pretty sure is not good physics, but considering how high non-superpowered characters can jump in this show, I'm guessing that wasn't something they were particularly concerned about. I mean, it's not like the comic dived really hard in with the explanations either, it's just, it was set up a little bit better. This also establishes Terra's ruthlessness and how dangerous she is, as even Slade starts to get a little bit uneasy because of how little she's holding back. Speaking of the Terminator himself, let's have a look at the differences between these two. There is just one main problem for the show's Slade. I agonized over whether to make this a neutral change because I know why the show did it, but the question is, was it necessary? If yes, it's a neutral change. If no, it's the comic did it better. And that is Slade's motivation.
A world without titans. I was beginning to think I'd never see the day.
I've bitched quite a bit before about how Slade has no ultimate goal in the show. Yes, he wants an apprentice, but why? He also has this big evil plan to do. What? I think due to the ingenious portrayal of this character simply as a malevolent presence and the absolutely pitch-perfect voice acting kind of blinds die-hard fans of the show to the fact that Slade is kind of aimless and a little bit pathetic. I mean, really, Slade? You have nothing better to do with your time than torment literal children? I mean, it's not as if they're even getting in your way. You are significantly smarter and more experienced than them. The only time they ever come after you is when you dangle a worm on a hook and say, "Come after me, please." Now, if Slade was simply just an evil character, this wouldn't be a problem. If they had significantly established that he just does this because he wants to make the Titans' lives miserable, if that was really all he wanted to do, that would be fine. But that's not what they portrayed with this character. They portrayed that he was this big, powerful person who had secret plans and wanted to take over the city, but how? Why? What? Where? What? And I've heard a lot of people say that, oh, the mystery surrounding this character was a brilliant writing choice and how we don't know what his ultimate goal is really adds to the character. And I'm like, no. That is just incomplete character motivation. There's no excusing that. And once again, if he was just an evil character, if this was done like Terra was done in the comics, if this was done to make a point that some people are just bad and out there to hurt you, especially if you're a young person, then again, this wouldn't even be a conversation I would be having. I would probably be praising this character to high heaven. But it's not. They try to imply that Slade is more than what he is without fully developing his motivation. And that, as brilliant as the rest of this character is, it is a writing mistake. Now, I understand this decision because the writers wanted to focus on the kids and their struggles because they're who they wanted their young audience to relate to. So all the villains, bar the Hive students and maybe Control Freak, I'm not really sure how old he is, are all controlling and often predatory adults. That is pretty good. However, this does not bar you from giving your villains clearer motivation. The comic did this better because the reason Deathstroke hates the Titans so much is because he holds them responsible for the death of his son Grant. A key example of characters' actions having long-running consequences is this, because Grant died in issue 2. Not that the show doesn't have very effective instances of characters' choices having long-running consequences they didn't foresee, It's just not something I can credit this particular arc with. Seriously though, Wolfman and Perez, despite having such disparate and complex stories in this series, managed to make it feel like one seamless flowing narrative. When you have things in issue 2 affecting issue 40 in a form of storytelling that is primarily episodic, you know you're dealing with a writer who pays attention to their writing. Amazing. Okay, time for the neutral changes, i.e. differences that don't affect the overall quality. One little thing that stuck out to me in the comic was just a little point about makeup Slade made before sending Terra back to the Titans. He says, "Ixnay on the makeup, cute superhero girls wouldn't be caught dead in it." And there are two ways of looking at this. On the writer's behalf, I am willing to go with the more charitable explanation that superhero girls would be too busy fighting the bad guys and getting dirty that there would be neither the time nor the point to put on makeup. But on Slade's behalf, because of the way he says it here, it's kind of like good superhero girls wouldn't be caught dead in that whore paint. So made up girls are the villainous temptresses, and the au naturel girls are the sweet, innocent superhero types. I don't know, this line just made me laugh. And it also reinforces what I've complained about in adaptations of Slade in the past, is this is what he is. Slade is such a prick. Now, there were a lot of parts of the Judas Contract story that were not included in the animated series, but I won't be going through them today. I'll be saving that for when I compare it to the movie, which is a more direct adaptation. But I do want to talk about the inclusion or lack of inclusion of these elements in terms of the effect it has on each iteration. As I've said, long-running comic book series can have the advantage of having storylines bleed into each other. And that has the effect of making you feel like you've stepped into a fully fleshed out world where many, many things can happen. This is possible in TV shows too, but not to the same extent because of the shared universe aspect. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen a trend towards recreating this in TV and cinematic form, but that was not the case when Teen Titans the Animated Series was airing. The conflicts are mostly confined to Jump City in order to create a tighter, easier to follow story. So as a result, the new Teen Titans has a lot going on while the actual Judas Contract storyline is happening, as well as further reaching aspects of the story itself and key character moments. As I've said, I'm not going to go through all of these, so I'm just going to give you a few key examples. Let's start with the other aspects of the Judas Contract the show left out, the main one being Brother Blood and his plot to capture the Titans so he can drain their life force and become more powerful so he can defeat the Justice League and take over the world, as is the ultimate end. Brother Blood does appear in the animated series, but he has nothing to do with the adaptation of the Judas Contract, so I won't be talking about him in terms of the show. As a result of leaving this out, the themes of religious fanaticism don't appear. But this is a neutral change because in order to be a show that a younger audience can digest, it's better to stay focused on one hard-hitting issue at a time. Moving on to the wider universe, we get to see the effect of the actions of powerful people on the poor and the powerless. It is comic books' unique way of storytelling that allows us to feel as though we've entered a fully fleshed out world where many things are happening as soon as we open the book. Whereas the kind of writing required to produce a more tightly written show doesn't allow for this. The way the animated series is written, it probably was the best decision to stick to the personal conflict as much as possible. In terms of key character moments, there are too many in the Judas Contract account. Wally West quitting, Donna Troy getting engaged, and most importantly, the Judas Contract is where Dick Grayson became Nightwing for the first time. And that is to say nothing about Slade's backstory and his entire family and how that has an effect on the Titans. But I won't be diving into this because there is nothing in the animated series to compare it to. And this is due to the ultimate decision to take the secret identity portion of the superhero mythos and just not say that it doesn't exist, but basically just ignore it. Again, to serve the age demographic a little bit better. The only reason I bring them up is to illustrate the key difference that the Judas Contract was a massive turning point in the lives and arcs of so many characters, whereas in the animated series, the story all belongs to Terra. As is my usual conclusion in this series, both of these properties are trying to do very different things. The Judas Contract comic was made to point out that some people who are blessed with great power just don't want to use it for good. I think it is unfair to label it as simply a born bad narrative, because the point was that sometimes people are just not nice. Sometimes people will trick you into thinking they care, but they just want something from you. And unlike in a children's show where I would argue you need more moral nuance in order to teach good morals to children, in the Judas Contract you do not get to mitigate Terra's actions by pointing to her circumstances. In the words of George Perez, what we didn't want to do is state that because she was this or because she was that, she was evil. There are people who are just not nice. Wonder Girl was brought up in an identical situation, only she turned out good. There was absolutely nothing in Terra's background that should have made her the character she was. And that is my main gripe with certain pockets of the animated series fanbase. They immediately jump to the fact that because show Terra was sympathetic and had more sympathetic reasons for going down the path she did, that made her a better character. Comic Terra had a tragic backstory as well, but the writers outright told you that yes, some people are born into bad situations, but they are still good people. I watched a YouTube video that shall remain nameless, stating that the Judas Contract was good, but the animated series improved upon it, brought it to its full potential. I think people who have this mindset are inexcusably missing the point. Oh, she's just an evil character, so that's just bad writing. No, my friend, no. That's just bad reading. And the fact that so many people are just so willing to jump to the conclusion that the animated series did it better simply because Terra was sympathetic shows how little we've evolved from the storytelling conventions Wolfman and Perez were trying to break down. Characters were split into villains and heroes. You knew who was who, and people were willing to accept that. That is, ironically, how the animated series is set up, with a couple of notable exceptions. And all of a sudden, it's inferior characterization because one seemingly good person turned out to have been a villain all along? Not a turncoat. A villain. She is quite a unique character in that sense. Yes, there have been many characters in the past who are bad for bad's sake, especially in the more simplistic era of storytelling. But this was, I think, the first character who the writers challenged the readers to find good in, but gave them nothing to find. I do not blame people who adapt this story for trying to give her more sympathetic traits, far from it. Sometimes this is done successfully, others very much not. Because this is kind of a one-and-done character model. Because once the point about her inherent villainy and the audience's preconceived notions about storytelling conventions has been made, there aren't really many more places you can take this character. So I am by no means saying that writers are wrong for trying to change it up. I just wish that more people would understand who this character was to begin with and recognize that that type of character has value. It's not an inferior character model just because there's no sympathy to her. And it's not because a sympathetic character has more reasons for doing what they do, they just have reasons that we can relate to more. Terra had her reasons for doing what she did, because the fact that the Titans were using great power for selfless means to help people absolutely disgusted her. That is something to explore, and I just hope that more writers in the future take a look at this character and see that she has value. And I know I have spent a great deal of this video going on the defensive about the comic, but that is not directed at the animated series in any way. Major props to what they managed to do here. The structure of the show hamstrung it from reaching its full potential, but still, they managed to create a truly touching and valuable narrative about choice, trauma, friendship, and redemption. So it fits into my 3-point adaptation rule. It didn't include a lot of great stuff from the comic, but it replaced it with something that was well worth the switch. And as a result, created an incredibly valuable and mature piece of media that children can learn from. So the final thing I want to talk about before I go is which iteration had the better Terra. I didn't put this in the comic or show section because there was a lot of setup I wanted to do before coming to my final decision. And I think it's ultimately a good place to end the video. I think both iterations and what they did are equally valuable, but one does come out on top. The show's Terra had a lot of technical writing problems. The pendulum seems to swing from I want to be your friend to you betrayed me to I'm fine with destroying these people's home to you're my friend, aren't you? Why aren't you being my friend? I have no comprehension as to why you wouldn't want to be my friend right now to I hate you because you were born to Beast Boy, aren't you going to talk to me? Again, these kind of emotional changes in a character as emotionally damaged and insecure as Terra are perfectly fine and fit in very well with how complex a character she is. But as I said, the pendulum just swings so rapidly back and forth that it feels like emotional whiplash. Making this a full Judas Contract season would have solved all of these problems. But again, I do understand why they felt as though they couldn't do that. So you might be expecting me to say the comic did it better. And while yes, I do think the comic had better construction, better pacing, and a more interesting premise, the show's Terra wins out for one very good reason. Terra's age. Yes, I am willing to accept that psychopaths exist and teenagers can do bad things simply because they want to. But I think Wolfman and Perez just had the blinders on in regards to this character and making her a switch-around villain because of how much crap they were getting about the new Teen Titans being so similar to the Uncanny X-Men. It also contains a lot of attitudes of their day about sexuality, smoking, and makeup of all things. So I don't think they stopped to fully consider just how freaking young this character is. And while 16 is more than old enough to know right from wrong and be held responsible for your actions to a degree a younger child wouldn't be able to, 16 is still a kid. So I think it is ultimately a mistake, both creatively and otherwise, to slap the irredeemable stamp on someone whose brain hasn't even finished developing yet. And I agonized over this decision, just considering the fact that psychopathy does exist and Terra could be a real person, just someone who naturally has the inability to empathize with people and as a result has no problem doing all these terrible things. But at the end of the day, it came down to technical competence versus a more well thought out idea. So it really comes down to which part of writing you think is more important. But for me, the show, with its much more thought out and carefully considered idea, just wins out. Her name was Terra Markov, and she is little more than 16 years old. And due to the fault of no one but herself, she is insane. No one taught her how to hate, yet she hates. Without cause, without reason. No one taught her to destroy, yet she destroys. With glee, with relish. Don't look for reasons which do not exist. Plainly, Terra Markov is what she is, and she has taken great power and made it as corrupt as she. Hers was the power over Earth itself. She could have brought life to deserts, heat to the frozen tundra, food to starving millions. She could have dammed raging rivers and funneled water to lands parched dry and dead. Her powers were limited only by the mind which controlled them. A mind which sought not hope, not love, not life, but death.
Her name was Terra. She was gifted with tremendous power and cursed with it as well. She was a dangerous enemy and a good friend, and she was one of the bravest people that I have ever known.